The night was bitterly cold. A thin mist curled through the empty streets, and the lamps along the road shone with a faint yellow glow. At the far corner of a quiet bus stop, a young nurse named Clara sat on a wooden bench. Her shoulders shook as she hugged herself tightly, trying to stay warm. She had finished a long, exhausting shift at the hospital, where she had been on her feet for almost 12 hours. Now, all she wanted was to get home, sink into bed, and sleep. But the bus was late. It was always late at that hour. Clara's uniform, though neat and clean, was far too thin for the freezing air. Her coat was an old one, the kind that no longer held much warmth. The icy wind seemed to cut through it easily. She tucked her hands into her pockets, but even inside, her fingers were stiff and numb. Her breath came out in small white clouds. She tried to rub her arms to keep her blood flowing, but it barely helped. She looked down the street, hoping to see headlights, but the road was empty. The city was still awake, but not here. This part of town was quiet, with only the sound of cars passing in the distance. Clara shivered again. She thought about calling a taxi, but then quickly shook her head. Her pay as a nurse was barely enough to cover her rent, food, and her mother's medicine. Spending money on a taxi was out of the question. So she waited. She leaned back against the cold bench, closing her eyes for a moment. She thought of her mother waiting at home, and how tomorrow she would have to wake up early again to go back to the hospital. Life felt like an endless circle: work, home, caring for her mother, then back to work. She was proud of her job, proud of helping people, but sometimes she wished she had a little more for herself. The wind grew harsher. Clara pulled her coat tighter, but her teeth began to chatter. Her legs felt weak, and for a second she wondered if she should just start walking. The problem was, her house was still too far, and walking alone at night in the freezing weather was risky. Just then, the sound of a car engine broke the silence. She lifted her head and saw a sleek black car slowing down near the bus stop. The vehicle was shiny, clearly expensive, with tinted windows that reflected the streetlights. Clara frowned slightly, unsure why such a car would stop here. The door opened, and a tall man stepped out. His dark overcoat looked warm, and his polished shoes clicked against the pavement. He looked around for a moment, then his eyes fell on Clara. Adrian Cole was a man most people recognized, even if they had never met him. A successful CEO, his name often appeared in business magazines and news articles. But Clara, exhausted and half-frozen, did not recognize him at first. To her, he was simply a stranger walking toward her in the middle of the night. Clara sat up straighter, a little nervous. She wasn't used to anyone approaching her at the bus stop. Usually, people passed by without a second glance. But this man seemed focused only on her. Adrian noticed the way she hugged herself, her pale cheeks, and the way her lips trembled from the cold. Something about the sight made him pause. Here was a young woman, clearly hard-working, stranded on a freezing night. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt a sharp tug in his chest. "You'll freeze out here," Adrian said, his voice deep but calm. Clara blinked. "I'm fine. I'm just waiting for the bus." Her tone was polite but firm. Adrian glanced at the empty road, then back at her. "The buses run late here. You'll be waiting a long time." "It's okay," Clara replied quickly. "I'll manage." She didn't want to look helpless. She had spent years being strong for her mother, for her patients, and for herself. Accepting help, especially from a stranger, wasn't something she did easily. But Adrian wasn't convinced. He studied her a moment longer, then said in a quiet but commanding tone, "You're coming with me." Clara's eyes widened. "Excuse me." "You're freezing," Adrian said firmly. "I can't just drive past and leave you here. Get in the car. You'll warm up while I take you home." Clara hesitated. Every warning in her head told her not to trust a stranger. She barely knew him, and the idea of stepping into a stranger's car felt dangerous. But then another gust of icy wind cut through her coat, making her shiver so hard she could barely sit straight. Her body was losing the fight against the cold. Adrian noticed her hesitation. He softened his voice, lowering the sternness in it. "I'm not asking to trouble you. It's just, unsafe out here. Let me help. At least sit in the car until your bus comes. If you're uncomfortable, I'll leave you right here. But you shouldn't be freezing like this." Clara studied him. There was no sign of mockery or ill intent in his face. His expression was steady, his eyes serious but kind. He didn't look like someone who wanted to take advantage. Instead, he looked like someone who was simply used to making decisions and sticking to them. Her fingers ached from the cold, her throat felt dry, and her whole body was trembling. Finally, she nodded slowly. "All right, just until the bus comes." Adrian gave a small nod and opened the car door for her. Clara stood, unsteady on her feet, and carefully stepped inside. The moment she sat down, a wave of warmth surrounded her. The car's heater was on, and it felt like stepping into another world. She leaned back against the soft leather seat, closing her eyes for a moment as relief washed over her. Adrian got into the driver's seat and glanced at her. She looked tired, no, exhausted. He wondered how long she had been working before ending up here at this lonely bus stop. Clara, still cautious, kept her hands folded in her lap. She didn't know who he was, and she wasn't ready to trust him fully. But for now, she couldn't deny the comfort of warmth after nearly freezing outside. The silence stretched for a few moments before Adrian finally spoke again. "What's your name?" "Clara," she said softly. "I'm Adrian," he replied simply. He didn't add his last name, nor mention that he was one of the city's most powerful CEOs. Something about the situation made him want to keep it simple. Clara gave a small nod but didn't ask further. She wasn't the type to pry. The car was quiet again, except for the low hum of the heater. Outside, the streets remained empty, and the bus still hadn't come. Clara glanced out the window, then back at Adrian. "You don't have to stay here," she said quietly. "I'll be okay." Adrian shook his head. "No. I'm not leaving you alone in this cold. I'll drive you home." Her lips parted slightly in surprise. "That's not necessary. I don't want to bother you." "You're not bothering me," Adrian said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Tell me your address." Clara hesitated again, torn between her pride and her growing weakness from the cold. After a long pause, she finally whispered her street name. Adrian nodded, started the car, and pulled away from the bus stop. Clara sat in silence, her mind racing. She didn't know why she trusted him, even a little. Maybe it was because he hadn't pressured her harshly, maybe because he seemed genuine. Or maybe it was simply because, for the first time in a long while, someone looked at her and refused to walk away. Outside, the city lights blurred past the windows. Inside the car, the warmth settled her trembling body. Clara leaned her head lightly against the seat, unsure of where this unexpected turn of fate would lead. Clara sat quietly in the car as it rolled through the empty streets. The heater was on, and the soft hum of the engine filled the silence between them. For the first time that night, she no longer felt like her body was freezing. The warmth spread slowly from her hands to her chest, loosening the tightness in her muscles. Still, her heart beat faster than usual, not from the cold but from the unfamiliar situation she found herself in. Adrian kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. He didn't speak right away. He knew she was tense, and he didn't want to frighten her. Instead, he gave her the space to settle into the warmth, to adjust to the idea that she was no longer waiting at the bus stop but sitting beside a stranger in a car that looked like it belonged to another world. Clara glanced sideways at him. He looked sharp, his dark overcoat neatly buttoned, his jawline strong, his expression calm but unreadable. He didn't seem like someone who went out of his way for others. The way he carried himself told her he was used to giving orders, used to being listened to. But here he was, slowing down his evening to help a nurse he didn't even know. "You don't have to drive me all the way," Clara finally said, her voice low but firm. "I can get down near the main road. I'll walk the rest." Adrian's eyes flickered toward her for a moment before returning to the road. "It's late. And it's too cold to walk. I'll take you to your door." She shook her head lightly. "You don't even know me." "You don't have to," he interrupted gently, but with a tone that left little space for argument. "You're freezing, and you almost collapsed back there. Letting you walk now isn't an option." Clara pressed her lips together, unsure how to reply. She wasn't used to people insisting on helping her. Most of the time, she was the one helping others, her patients, her colleagues, her mother at home. To accept kindness, especially this kind of kindness, felt strange. The car turned onto a quieter street, and she looked out of the window to avoid his gaze. The city lights reflected on the glass, soft and golden. In the silence, she thought about her day, the endless hours at the hospital, the emergencies, the tired smiles she gave her patients. By the time she left work, her body was drained. That was why she had ended up waiting at the bus stop instead of walking. She hadn't had the strength to move anymore. Adrian, watching her from the corner of his eye, noticed the weariness on her face. It wasn't just the cold, it was the exhaustion of someone carrying too many responsibilities on her shoulders. For reasons he didn't fully understand, he felt a pull of concern. He was used to meetings, contracts, and boardrooms filled with powerful people. But here, in his car, sat a young woman whose life looked nothing like his, and yet he couldn't ignore her. "Do you always take the bus home after such long shifts?" Adrian asked quietly, breaking the silence. Clara hesitated before answering. "Most of the time, yes. It's cheaper." He frowned slightly. "You work all night helping people, and then you wait in the cold for a bus that might not even come on time." She gave a small shrug. "That's just how it is. Not everyone can afford more." Her words lingered in the air, simple but heavy. Adrian realized then just how different their worlds were. For him, a car, a driver, comfort, these were things he never questioned. For her, saving the small cost of a taxi meant enduring the freezing night without complaint. When they stopped at a red light, Adrian glanced at her again. Her coat was thin, her shoes a little worn. Yet she sat upright, with a quiet dignity that impressed him. She wasn't complaining. She wasn't asking for anything. She was simply enduring. "You shouldn't have to go through that," Adrian said finally, almost to himself. Clara looked at him, a little puzzled. "Life isn't always about what we should or shouldn't have. We just make do." Her answer caught him off guard. He had spent years in business, hearing people talk about what they deserved, what they wanted, what they demanded. But here was someone who had far less than most, and instead of bitterness, she had acceptance and quiet strength. The light turned green, and the car moved forward again. After a few minutes, Clara's voice softened. "Thank you, for stopping tonight. Most people wouldn't." Adrian's lips curved slightly, the closest thing to a smile she had seen on him. "Most people don't notice. But I did." She didn't respond, but something about the way he said it stayed with her. The road grew narrower as they approached her neighborhood. The tall buildings of the city gave way to smaller houses and quiet lanes. Adrian slowed the car, following her directions carefully. The street lights here were dimmer, and the sidewalks cracked in places. It was clear this was a more modest part of town. Finally, Clara pointed to a small house with peeling paint but warm light glowing from the window. "That's mine," she said softly. Adrian parked in front of the house and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them felt different now, less awkward, more thoughtful. Clara reached for the door handle. Thank you for the ride. Really? Adrian's gaze rested on her, serious and steady. Take care of yourself. The world needs people like you. She blinked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his words. No one had ever said something like that to her before. She gave a small nod, then stepped out of the car. The cold night air brushed against her again, but it wasn't as harsh as before. Adrian watched her walk up to the door, where the light from inside spilled onto the small porch. He didn't know why, but he stayed until she unlocked the door and stepped in safely. Only then did he start the engine again. As the car pulled away, Clara stood just inside her doorway, still thinking about what had happened. She hadn't expected anyone to notice her that night, let alone insist on helping. And she certainly hadn't expected someone like him, a man who clearly lived in a different world, to care. For Adrian, driving away, the image of Clara shivering at the bus stop wouldn't leave his mind. He had seen countless faces in his life, business partners, investors, employees, but none had stayed with him quite like hers. There was something about the quiet strength in her eyes, the way she held herself even when she was nearly collapsing from cold and exhaustion. The city lights glittered in the distance as he drove, but for the first time in a long while, Adrian wasn't thinking about his business meetings or upcoming deals. He was thinking about a nurse he had found at a lonely bus stop, and how a single decision to stop the car had shifted something inside him. And though neither of them knew it yet, this small act of kindness was only the beginning of a connection that would shape both of their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The next evening was colder than the last. Clara finished another long shift at the hospital, and her body felt heavier than ever. She thought of the bus stop again and the freezing wind that had cut through her the night before. But she also remembered the car, the warmth, and the stranger who had insisted on helping her. Adrian. She still didn't know much about him, only his first name. Yet the memory of his voice, firm but kind, had stayed with her. She tried to push it aside as she packed her bag and left the hospital, but something about that night lingered. Meanwhile, Adrian sat in his office high above the city. The glass walls of his corner office reflected the city lights, but he wasn't paying attention to them. Papers and reports lay neatly on his desk, but his mind wasn't on business. He had thought about Clara more than once since dropping her home. The image of her sitting at that cold bus stop had replayed in his mind. He couldn't explain it. He met countless people every week, investors, partners, employees. Yet none of their faces had stayed with him the way hers did. Perhaps it was because she hadn't asked for anything. She hadn't begged or pleaded. She had only sat there, quietly enduring, determined to manage on her own. That strength had moved him in a way he hadn't expected. Later that night, when fate intervened again, their worlds crossed once more. Clara was walking slowly down the street after leaving the hospital, heading toward the bus stop, when she noticed the same sleek black car parked at the corner. She froze for a second, unsure if it was just coincidence. Then, as if sensing her, Adrian stepped out. He was dressed in another long coat, neat and elegant, and he looked at her with the same calm expression she remembered. "You're not standing at that bus stop again," he said simply, as if it was already decided. Clara blinked, startled. You're here?" "Yes," Adrian replied. "And I'm not letting you freeze again. Come on." Clara shook her head lightly, a small smile forming despite her exhaustion. "You can't keep showing up like this." "I'm fine." "No," Adrian said firmly, "you're not fine. You're tired. You've been on your feet for hours. And the cold isn't any kinder tonight than it was yesterday. Get in the car." She hesitated. Part of her wanted to argue, to insist that she didn't need saving. But another part of her, the part that remembered the warmth of the car and the relief she had felt, couldn't deny how tempting his offer was. With a sigh, she finally nodded and walked toward the car. Adrian opened the door for her without a word, and she slipped inside. As the car began moving, the silence between them felt heavier this time. Clara was curious about him now. She studied his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the way he focused on the road with quiet confidence. He wasn't like anyone she knew. Everything about him, his car, his clothes, even his manner spoke of a world she had never stepped into. Finally, curiosity got the better of her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. Adrian glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Because I can't stand by and do nothing." "But you don't know me," Clara pressed. "I don't need to," Adrian replied. "I know enough. I know you spend your nights working for others, and then you wait for a bus in the freezing cold. That's enough for me to care." Clara looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. No one had ever said something like that to her before. Most people barely noticed her outside the hospital. She was simply another nurse in a uniform, blending into the background. But this man, this stranger, had noticed. When they reached her street again, Adrian didn't drive away immediately. Instead, he asked, "Do you live here alone?" Clara shook her head. "No, I live with my mother. She's unwell, so I take care of her when I'm not at the hospital." Something in Adrian's chest tightened. He had expected her to say she was tired because of work, but hearing that she also carried responsibilities at home made him see her in an even stronger light. She wasn't just hardworking, she was selfless. "You do all that, and still, you don't ask for help?" Adrian asked. Clara gave a small, almost shy smile. "Help doesn't come easy in life. You learn to manage with what you have." Her words struck him. He had lived his whole life surrounded by resources, staff, assistants, money to solve problems instantly. Yet here she was, managing everything with so little, and still speaking without bitterness. Before she got out of the car, Adrian made a sudden decision. "Come by tomorrow evening," he said. Clara looked at him in surprise. "What? Why?" "Because I want to know more about you," Adrian said honestly. "And because I think you deserve at least one evening where you don't feel like the world is resting on your shoulders." Clara blinked, caught off guard. She didn't know what to say. No one had ever invited her like that before, certainly not someone like him. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said cautiously. Adrian's lips curved slightly. "It's only dinner. Nothing more." Clara hesitated again, her heart torn. Part of her told her to refuse. They were from different worlds. It didn't make sense. But another part of her, the part that longed for a break, for just a moment to breathe, whispered that maybe she deserved it. Finally, she gave a small nod. "All right. Just dinner." Adrian's eyes softened, though his tone remained steady. "I'll pick you up tomorrow after your shift." As Clara stepped out of the car and walked up to her house, she felt her heart beating faster. She couldn't believe what had just happened. She had spent years living quietly, unnoticed, focused only on her work and her mother. Now, suddenly, someone had stepped into her life, insisting on helping, insisting on noticing her. Inside the car, Adrian leaned back against the seat for a moment before driving away. He had made countless deals in his life, decisions worth millions. But this inviting Clara felt more important than any business choice he had made. He didn't know why, but he wanted to know her story. He wanted to understand her world. That night, Clara lay awake longer than usual, thinking about him. His words, his presence, the warmth of the car, all of it replayed in her mind. She wasn't sure where this was going, or if it even made sense. But for the first time in years, she felt something stir inside her, a tiny spark of curiosity, of hope, of possibility. And though she tried to convince herself that it was just dinner, she knew deep down that it was the beginning of something that could change everything. The following evening arrived faster than Clara expected. All day at the hospital, her mind had wandered back to the conversation she'd had with Adrian. His invitation echoed in her head, and though she had tried to focus on her patients and duties, she couldn't help but feel both nervous and curious about what was to come. When her shift finally ended, Clara changed out of her scrubs and into a simple dress she had kept in her small locker for special occasions. It wasn't new, but it was neat and comfortable. She didn't own anything extravagant, and she wasn't trying to impress anyone. Still, she found herself checking her reflection twice before leaving the hospital, smoothing her hair, and wondering if she looked presentable. Outside, the air was sharp and cold. Clara hugged her coat tighter around her as she stepped into the street. And there, waiting near the hospital entrance, was the same sleek black car she remembered. Adrian stood beside it, dressed sharply as always, but tonight there was a softer look in his eyes when he saw her. "You came," he said simply, his voice calm but carrying something deeper, like relief. Clara gave a small nod. "I said I would." Adrian opened the car door for her, and she stepped inside. The warmth of the car wrapped around her again, and for a moment, it felt like the stress of her long shift melted away. As Adrian took the driver's seat, she couldn't help but glance at him from the corner of her eye. He seemed completely at ease, like he belonged in every elegant space, yet there was a quiet attentiveness in the way he adjusted the temperature and made sure she was comfortable. "Where are we going?" Clara asked after a few minutes of silence. "To dinner," Adrian replied with a small smile. "Somewhere peaceful." The car glided through the city streets, past tall glass buildings and glowing signs. Clara rarely visited this part of town. It was brighter, cleaner, and felt like another world compared to the modest neighborhood where she lived. She stayed quiet, unsure what to say, until Adrian finally spoke again. "You look tired," he said gently. "I am," Clara admitted with a light laugh. "But that's nothing new." "You work too hard," he said, his tone serious. Clara looked at him, slightly amused. "And how would you know that?" Adrian glanced at her, his eyes steady. "I can see it in your face. In the way you carry yourself. You're strong, but even strong people get worn down." She didn't reply immediately. His words touched something inside her, something she rarely let anyone notice. After a moment, she gave a small shrug. "That's just life. I chose this job. And I chose to take care of my mother. It's not easy, but it's what I have to do." Her honesty lingered in the air, and Adrian respected it. He didn't try to argue. Instead, he simply nodded and drove on, as if silently acknowledging her strength. When they arrived at the restaurant, Clara's eyes widened slightly. The building was tall and modern, with soft golden lights glowing from its windows. Inside, the space was warm and inviting, with gentle music playing in the background. The air smelled of fresh bread and spices, and every table was set with elegance. Clara hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware of her simple dress and old coat. But Adrian noticed her unease and leaned toward her slightly. "Don't worry," he said quietly. "You belong here just as much as anyone else." Those words gave her a small wave of comfort, and she followed him inside. They were shown to a quiet corner table by the window. From there, Clara could see the city lights shimmering in the distance. It felt unreal, like she was looking out at a world she never thought she'd step into. As they sat down, Adrian ordered with ease, speaking to the waiter in a tone that was confident but never arrogant. Clara noticed how people treated him with respect, how he seemed to carry authority without needing to show it off. She wondered again who exactly he was, though she still didn't know the truth about his status. When the food arrived, it was unlike anything Clara usually ate. The plates were arranged beautifully, the flavors rich and delicate. She ate carefully, almost shyly, while Adrian watched her with quiet amusement. "You're not used to this," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "Is it that obvious?" "Not in a bad way," he replied quickly. "It's just refreshing. You're not pretending. Most people I sit across from are busy playing roles. You're just being yourself." Clara lowered her eyes, not sure how to respond. No one had ever said that to her before. As the evening went on, their conversation deepened. Adrian asked about her work, and Clara found herself talking more than she expected. She told him about her patients, about the moments that were both heartbreaking and fulfilling, about the exhaustion and the small victories that kept her going. He listened carefully, without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. And in return, he spoke not about business deals or wealth, but about simpler things. He told her about how lonely success could feel, how the higher he climbed, the fewer people around him seemed genuine. He didn't mention his title or his company, but Clara could sense that his life was far removed from hers. Yet, in that quiet corner of the restaurant, the distance between their worlds seemed to shrink. At one point, Clara laughed softly at something he said. It wasn't a loud laugh, just a quiet one, but it surprised even her. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed like that, without feeling weighed down by worries. Adrian noticed, and his chest warmed at the sight. He realized then how much he wanted to see that smile again. The evening stretched on longer than Clara expected. By the time they left the restaurant, the streets outside were quiet, the night air crisp but not too harsh. Adrian walked beside her, and though he didn't say much, his presence felt steady, protective. When they reached the car, Clara paused. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "For tonight." It was different. In a good way. Adrian looked at her for a moment before replying. "It won't be the last." His words carried a certainty that made her heart skip. She didn't know what he meant by that, or how much he intended to be a part of her life, but the sincerity in his tone was undeniable. On the ride back, the silence between them was no longer heavy. It felt comfortable now, filled with an unspoken understanding. Clara leaned back against the seat, tired but content in a way she hadn't felt in years. When they pulled up in front of her house, Adrian waited until she turned to him. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then Clara gave a small nod. "Good night, Adrian." "Good night, Clara," he replied softly. As she stepped out and walked to her door, Adrian stayed in the car, watching until she was safely inside. Only then did he drive away, the image of her quiet smile still in his mind. That night, as Clara lay in bed, she realized something had shifted inside her. The world still carried the same responsibilities, the same struggles, but she no longer felt completely invisible. Someone had noticed her, cared enough to pull her out of the cold and show her a different side of life. And though she tried to remind herself that it was just one evening, deep down, she knew it was the start of something more. The following days seemed to move differently for Clara. She still woke up early, still worked long hours at the hospital, still returned home to care for her mother. Her life hadn't changed in routine, but there was something new in the way her days felt. A quiet memory kept her company: the warmth of the car, the quiet corner of the restaurant, and the way Adrian had looked at her as if she mattered. She reminded herself often that they were from different worlds. He had the calm confidence of someone who lived with comfort and certainty, while she had spent her life making do with little. And yet, despite the distance between their lives, he had reached out to her in a way no one ever had. Adrian, on the other hand, found himself distracted in his office. His meetings, usually sharp and clear, felt less important. His thoughts wandered back to Clara, to the way she spoke with quiet honesty, to the strength she carried without realizing it. In a world where almost everyone wanted something from him, Clara wanted nothing. That, more than anything, had drawn him closer. One evening, after another exhausting shift, Clara stepped outside the hospital and was not surprised to see his car waiting. She tried to smile at the sight, though she shook her head lightly when he walked up to her. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said softly. "I know," Adrian replied calmly. "But I want to." There was no argument in his voice, only certainty. Clara sighed gently and allowed herself to get into the car once more. This time, instead of driving to a restaurant, Adrian took her to his home. She hesitated when she realized his building was tall, modern, and shining against the city skyline. Everything about it spoke of wealth and a life she could barely imagine. "I don't think I should," she began, but Adrian stopped her gently. "You're safe here. Trust me." There was something in his voice that reassured her, so she followed him inside. The elevator carried them up to the top floor, where Adrian's penthouse opened into a wide, elegant space filled with soft lights and clean lines. Large windows revealed the city glowing below like a blanket of stars. Clara paused at the entrance, overwhelmed. Adrian noticed her hesitation. "It's just a place to live," he said quietly. "Don't let it make you uncomfortable." But it wasn't discomfort that filled Clara, it was the sharp reminder of how different their lives were. Still, she stepped inside, following him to a quiet sitting area where he poured her tea instead of wine, as if he had known she would prefer something simple. They sat across from each other, the warm cups in their hands. For a moment, Clara looked around, trying to take in the space without showing her awe. Adrian, however, was only looking at her. "You work so hard," he said softly. "When do you rest?" Clara let out a small laugh. "Rest is a luxury. My patients need me. My mother needs me. If I stop, everything falls apart." Adrian leaned forward slightly. "But what about you? Who takes care of you?" The question silenced her. She had never thought about it that way. She had always been the one to hold things together, to carry responsibilities without complaint. No one had ever asked her who carried her. She lowered her eyes. "No one needs to. I'm fine." Adrian shook his head gently. "Even the strongest people need someone to lean on sometimes. You don't have to carry everything alone." His words settled deep inside her, opening a place in her heart she had locked away for years. She didn't answer, but the silence between them spoke louder than words. As the evening went on, their conversation flowed more easily. Adrian asked her about her dreams, and at first, she almost laughed. Dreams had felt far away for so long. But slowly, she admitted that she once wanted to travel, to see more of the world, to do more than just survive from one shift to another. Adrian listened carefully, not as a man used to granting wishes but as someone who truly wanted to understand. And Clara, though hesitant, found herself sharing more than she had with anyone in years. Later, when it was time for her to leave, Adrian drove her home as always. But this time, as she stepped out of the car, he said quietly, "Clara, I don't want this to end with just a few rides and dinners. I want to be part of your world. If you'll let me." Clara froze, her hand on the door. Her heart raced at his words. She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to accept, to believe in the kindness he offered. But another part feared that it was too good to be true, that their differences were too vast. "You don't belong in my world," she said softly. "It's small and hard and nothing like yours." Adrian's voice was steady when he replied. "Then let me belong. I don't care how different our worlds are. What matters is you." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the cold night air disappeared, leaving only the warmth of his sincerity. She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes told him she had heard him. In the days that followed, Clara tried to keep her focus on work, but Adrian's words echoed in her heart. He continued to appear, sometimes waiting for her outside the hospital, sometimes bringing her small comforts like hot tea on her breaks. He never forced his way into her life, but he never let her push him away either. And slowly, Clara realized something. For years, she had carried everything alone, believing that was the only way forward. But now, with Adrian beside her, she didn't feel as heavy. The burdens were still there, the long shifts, her mother's health, the endless responsibilities, but for the first time, she felt she wasn't invisible. One evening, after another long day, Clara stepped out of the hospital and saw Adrian waiting as usual. But instead of hesitating, instead of reminding him he didn't have to be there, she walked straight to him with a small smile. "You're stubborn," she said softly. Adrian smiled faintly. "Only when it matters." Clara took a deep breath, her eyes shining with quiet strength. "Then maybe I can let you be part of my world. If you're sure that's what you want." Adrian's eyes softened, and for the first time, Clara saw something break through his calm exterior: genuine happiness. "I've never been more sure of anything," he said. That night, as they drove together through the city streets, Clara looked out at the lights and realized her life had begun to change. She was still the same nurse, still the same daughter caring for her mother, still living in a modest home. But now, there was someone beside her who saw her not as invisible, not as ordinary, but as someone worth noticing, worth caring for. And though the world around them was still divided by wealth and status, Clara understood that sometimes, the most important connections were born not out of similarity but out of sincerity. The night that had once started with freezing winds at a lonely bus stop had turned into something neither of them expected: a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. A bond built not on what they had, but on who they were. And as Adrian drove on, and Clara sat quietly beside him, both of them knew that this was only the beginning of a journey they would walk together, no matter how different their worlds had once seemed.